let's talk about NEFE's personal finance ecosystem. This is the highlight of our webinar today, and where we're going to spend the vast majority of our time. The first thing that I wanted to ask about, though, is what comes to mind when you hear the term ecosystem? So I'm just curious, because I'm guessing it is not financial education. If you want to pop into the chat with what comes to mind, feel free, or just think to yourself, or sort of in your mind's eye, what do you picture when you hear the term ecosystem? So I don't know about you, but as I said before, personal finance isn't the first thing that comes to mind. I sort of think of something like this, sort of like, something kind of habitat-like, or, ecological, if you will. Oh, great. I love it. Tiffany, working together. Yeah, something science related. That's what comes to mind first for me. So this is a definition, actually, this is the kids' definition of an ecosystem from Merriam-Webster, a system made up of an ecological community of living things interacting with their environment, especially under natural conditions. And so I love this idea, that this is not just, one thing, but all of the interaction. So yeah, that working together component is key here. And I think this is an interesting visual as well, sort of the components of what we think of in terms of an ecosystem in sort of, ecology, biology, science, what have you. It's not just the fish. The fish can't live with just the fish, right? Now there's a fish, there's other fish like that, but it's part of a collection of sea animals, right? But not only that, they need something to eat, they need water to swim in. All of that makes up this whole interdependent sort of network within that ecosystem. And so that is really where this idea and this spread from science really to other areas in the use of the term ecosystem. So this is the second regular definition of ecosystem from Merriam-Webster, which is something such as a network of businesses considered to resemble an ecological ecosystem, especially because of its complex interdependent parts. And so again, that idea that, one of them can't exist without the others, that there's a lot of pieces and parts that are all kind of complicated and interdependent in how they relate to each other. So, for example, the first times that I started hearing about this a number of years ago, or the terms, started sort of creeping up a little bit more often, was at first I saw it more in sort of the literature that was more sort of business related, right? Talking about ecosystems and what have you. Here's another example of a business ecosystem in action. Again, seeing that term start to apply in the business sector, and then also translating that over into education. So here, this is another visual. This comes from a company, HSI, about what is a learning ecosystem made of? The content, the strategy, the people, the technology, the learning culture. There's lots of components to a learning ecosystem. You don't deliver technology or don't deliver content in a vacuum. There are people involved. There's a strategy for doing that, and for aligning how instruction might work. There's technology involved, all sorts of different things that all sort of go back and forth and feed off of each other. Here's a different one. This one is focused on urban higher education. And this really puts this into practice in particular. And one of the things I like about this is this notion that it puts students at the center. So you see the student here is at the center, almost as if we were going to draw an ecosystem of the fish, from earlier, but the fish would kind of be at the center, and everything that is involved in making sure that fish thrives is all around it and interconnected. Similarly here, in order for a student to thrive in a well-functioning ecosystem of higher education, there are a lot of different components and parts. And so we move from that to the personal finance ecosystem. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen this before, It's been around now. This one was released last year, this version, and we'll get and talk a few minutes about in a few minutes about some of its previous iterations. But this is sort of, an infographic style look at what are all the factors in personal finance that impact a person's financial well-being. So really here again, kind of like we saw a minute ago with the higher education example, if we look closely here at the beginning, this is centered on the individual, right? And their financial well-being. So just like we had the student here in the higher ed example, in our personal finance ecosystem, we're focused on the individual and their financial well-being. And all these other components kind of go, are sort of looping around and all involved and overlapping with that financial well-being component. One might say that you cannot be financially well or have a high level of financial well-being or any level of financial well-being for that matter without these other components, that they all are interrelated and connect to personal finance and financial well-being. So again, here it's sort of that, Venn diagram almost, if you will, is another way to look at it, where, the financial well-being is that intersection of all of those other components. So everybody has a level of financial well-being. It is something that changes over time. These are some key tenets of what NEFE and the National Endowment for Financial Education and others have talked about in terms of financial well-being. And I'll offer up an alternate definition and sort of a comparable here at the end if we have time. But financial well-being is not an end point. This is not a destination that we reach. It's something that we have a state of this at any given point in time. It is also very important to note that financial well-being is self-assessed or subjective, and it is different for every person. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. Part of what that says is I can't tell you what your financial well-being, level is. I don't know, because I don't know everything that you have going on, both in terms of objective, measures or reference points like income or expenses or, money and savings or the amount of debt one might have, but also in terms of the other factors that go into making up financial well-being. And we'll see a lot of those as we talk through, what all these factors are that impact financial well-being. I love the analogy that they offer, and I'll share some others in a few minutes, but I'm sure all of us have at some point probably seen the pain scale, especially if you've ever been in, to the doctors or a hospital, and they say, what would you rate on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say your pain is right now? And, this is again, a very subjective and personal and self-assessed, rating scale, right? This is a level of pain, just like we talk about a level of financial well-being. You can have an excellent level of financial well-being. You could say, I have the best financial well-being right now ever, right? I would, score myself very high in financial well-being, which is kind of, a little bit different in terms of, flipping the 0 and the 10. But, I might have very similar, circumstances, perhaps, to a friend of mine. And we could both have a very different response to this, right? If you and I both banged our elbow on the table or stubbed our toe or, had a broken ankle or whatever the case may be, my assessment of that, or even a paper cut, right? My assessment of the pain level is very likely going to be different from yours. We all sort of look at things a little bit differently. We self-assess things maybe perhaps I'm comparing my level of pain and saying, well, it's nothing like when I was in pain from this before, right? Maybe I have different benchmarks. Maybe I just have a higher threshold for pain or whatever it is, right? It's all subjective and it's all personal. And, nobody can tell you what it is or it isn't. So similar, again, in terms of the financial well-being level, you don't know what somebody else's level of financial well-being is, unless they share it with you, because it is self-perceived, self-assessed, and we shouldn't be trying to, label that for others. And so that is a key component really here in our, our analysis or our examination of financial well-being. So what does financial well-being include? Well, it really has to do with, your satisfaction with managing your present situation, feeling like you have choices. So, they always say money can't buy happiness, but there is definitely something to be said for having a lack of choices, right? And I often talk about how, sort of with limited resources, often your choices are limited, and that can have an impact. And so when we feel like we have choices, that can improve our financial well-being. Similarly, that kind of goes hand in hand with that control aspect, like you have control over your life and how you feel about the future, and whether or not you have the ability to see yourself heading in the direction that you want, or if, maybe things are not going in the direction that you had hoped. And so when it comes to the personal finance ecosystem, again, we see financial well-being here playing that, that center pivotal role. Everything else is, is sort of facing into that and impacting the person's financial well-being as we look at this. We're going to take a look at each segment of this in a little bit, but I wanted to just point out in the full version of the ecosystem, we have these, what I'll talk about later as catalysts for change, and it indicates that knowledge influencers are up here on sort of this one upper left-hand corner. And the first time I saw this, I thought, man, that's really interesting, because I actually kind of think teachers have a role in almost all of these, right? Except at the same time, there are things that you as an educator can't control, right? There are things that individuals can't control themselves. And so I think one of the things that I find most fascinating about this work, and sort of thinking about this from, taking a step back and looking at this, is, what do we as educators have an ability to influence or improve for our students' financial well-being? What are the components of this that, we can't change, that, we get them as they are and we do our best with them, and, whatever other circumstances are, we are beyond our control. There are certain things you cannot change for your students, right? And so looking at some of those components, both for us as educators, and then also, I think it's really kind of cool, this idea of students, especially, high school students, being able to think about, well, what all is going to impact my financial well-being? Yes, they can take a course in personal finance, and everybody, I would hope, could or should at some point be able to do that. But financial education isn't a silver bullet, right? Like, a lot of times we know exactly what we're supposed to do, but unless we actually, make good on that in our decision making, it doesn't solve all of the problems of the world. So we're going to dive in, as I said, in a little bit more detail on each of these in a little bit. Before we move on, though, I wanted to mention this work has been done by, published by the National Endowment for Financial Education. In financial education world, we call that NEFE. If that name is familiar, you might recognize it because they were the ones that have produced the high school financial planning program. So this is a high school, it was a free financial education curriculum for high school students and teachers that started back in, I think, 1984. So it was around for a very long time. And sadly for many educators, it sunset. in 2021. So coming up on 2 years at the end of this school year. At that point in time, NEFE decided, hey, things have changed over the time that we've been in business and that we've had this approach. We've been doing this for a really long time. And when we started it, it was because nobody else was doing it. Now there's, so many different sources of curriculum out there. Maybe we should sort of, rethink where we put our efforts and our resources so that we can best reach our overall objectives. And so they issued an entirely new strategic plan and sort of took a look at, where is NEFE going to go and what role can that organization play in the financial education landscape, or one might say the financial education ecosystem that would be of value and add value to what is being done at the national level. And so this is this personal finance ecosystem is part of that sort of shift in focus, right? And so this is on the website at nefe.org. And I think Paige shared the link earlier, but I'm going to ask her to share that one again, or you just scroll up and you'll find the link to this. Thanks, Paige. I appreciate it. So, this is where you want to go to access the ecosystem. On their website, they have it broken down with details around each section. You can download a PDF that has some additional resources, as well as some of the older versions of this as well. We're going to look now. I just clipped this intro video from NEFE to share with you the first minute or so. So let's take a look and listen to this for just a second. Oops.
Financial well-being is an element of personal well-being that many public institutions, companies, and nonprofit organizations are working to advance for individuals and communities. The National Endowment for Financial Education, or NEFE, created the personal finance ecosystem as a visual roadmap to lay out the foundations that underpin an individual's level of financial well-being. This video gives a short overview of the third version of the model, launched in 2022, which incorporates observations and feedback from practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders. Every person's level of individual financial well-being is influenced by three main factors. Foundational factors, such as their values, culture, and socioeconomics. Financial knowledge and access, including financial skills and access to financial products. And financial actions and outcomes, a cycle of mindset, choices, and results, including unexpected events. In practice, educators, advocates, policymakers, and other contributors target these factors via catalysts for change.
So that's a little overview from NEFE. It goes a little bit longer on the full version on the site, but it mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, that this is the third iteration of this. And so wanted to spend a minute just taking a look at the first, second, and now this version. This is the first one that was introduced in 2019. And a lot of people weighed in and provide feedback. And so from there, they iterated upon it. But you see this notion that in this version, everything started with financial education, right? And that did a certain number of things in terms of general skills and abilities and financial knowledge and decision-making skills. And then there are these external factors, right? And then that all of these together lead to financial capability. And that if you then, have these other components added in, then you reach a state of, or that these then influence your level of financial well-being. And so, again, this was their first attempt at trying to pull together a lot of these components and putting it into a format for discussion. And so, like I said before, NEFE is fantastic at bringing people together and really having some great conversations around some of these topics, and so that's what, that's what they did. They asked, for feedback and for input from the field, from practitioners, what have you. And the second version is, anybody think this looks anything like something they might have seen before? Maybe like a food pyramid-ish, once upon a time kind of deal. And here you see that financial well-being is kind of like the pinnacle, right? It's almost representing this state that we want to reach. And I think for some people that was counterintuitive to this notion that, you have a constantly fluctuating level of financial well-being. It's not necessarily a state to be achieved, that like you don't get to that level without all of these things, that really, everybody has a level of financial well-being all the time. And so that and other sort of, feedback led to the version 3. So this is where we are now with this sort of, I don't know, almost not quite like hub and spoke, but I kind of think sometimes they look like petals of a flower. If you have thoughts on what you think this looks like or reminds you of, or a better description or descriptor for it, please don't hesitate to let me know. But this is, where we are now with this current version, and I think it encapsulates a lot of those other components, maybe I think in a better visual, a better representation of how these all have this, sort of interplay. And so I want to talk about this from that perspective of, you as educators and your students looking at financial well-being. And, again, the financial well-being for a student isn't that much different really than it is for an adult. This really is satisfaction with, managing present situation, freedom to exercise choice, feeling in control of finances, and the outlook for the future. For the most part, a lot of students are going to be future oriented, right? They're not making all of their own personal financial decisions. They're not in that circumstance. This really is about their future. But there's also certainly an interplay with that in their current level of financial well-being within their family, right? And that's influenced by their family's finances, which may or may not be similar to what they're hoping to have in their future. And we'll get back to that a little bit in a few minutes. So again, mentioned this earlier, this notion, you could talk to students about, do you think anybody else has the same level of financial well-being as you do? What would make it similar or different? That you and a friend could have lots of things in common, but have a very different level of financial well-being. That even that this persists though across lots of different kinds of things. That very similarly, you and I could even like the same kind of music, and yet, or movies, and one of us might think something is fantastic and the other one doesn't. It's subjective, right? And that whole notion of subjectivity that plays into this. Same thing with art. We can even think about, like, you and I might define or determine what is in my mind or in your mind, which is really the subjective self-determined part of this, what it means to be healthy, right? Like, for some people, it is the number on the scale. And others would say that's not what you should pay attention to. You should pay attention to, how, some of these other numbers, or maybe no numbers at all, but just about how do you feel? Can you go up and down the stairs without getting out of breath? There's all sorts of different subjective ways to measure health. And so, very similar to this idea of financial well-being may mean something a little different for you than it does for me. And we can all look at things a little bit differently. So if you've ever had a chance to look at it, there's on the PDE SAS portal, we have, I will admit, an outdated, hopefully to be revamped when things are done with some of our efforts with the state standards. But there is a personal finance, model personal finance course for high school students on SAS. And with each of the 6 units, they're each tied to one of our big ideas. We list misconceptions and proper conceptions. And so if we think about that in the terms of financial well-being, one of those I think about is this notion that, or misconception that students might hold, that your financial well-being is predetermined based on your upbringing or socioeconomic status. I think back, and some of you have known me for a while, know that my background, I started teaching in Virginia in a very inner city, very low socioeconomic area with students who, for the most part, their parents weren't banked. They weren't using, mainstream financial institutions. They were using check cashers and payday lenders. Many of them, barely getting by. And so I had students who I think had this preconceived notion that that was what they were destined to, right? That was the life they were born into, and that, from a financial standpoint, that was pretty much it, right? As opposed to understanding that there are other factors that can improve or that can impact your financial well-being, many of which you might argue you can control and you can do something about. And so I think that's a pretty powerful message for students to say, hey, yeah, some of this stuff, this might, you can't deny it. It's gonna play a role, and there's been a lot of criticism of financial education that has this notion that, you can budget your way out of poverty, right? No, you can't. You have to have access to good paying jobs. You have to have availability of goods and services at a reasonable price, right? Those are not things you can just budget your way out of. But at the same time, there is a holistic component of this, right? So that is a very important component or piece of this, I think, that we can engage and talk about with students and, challenge them to consider. Similarly, this notion that, well, it is what it is, right? No, like your financial well-being can change over time, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. It is likely to be an ever-changing state. It's kind of like sort of your health or your psychological well-being. All of those are constantly changing based on a whole myriad of different things that are impacting those. This third one goes hand in hand, I think, with that first one, this idea that you can influence things. And then the last one, this goes back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, but this idea that, financial knowledge is the key to financial well-being. In that first version of the ecosystem, we kind of saw that, like, sort of saying like, okay, well, it all starts with financial education, then there's some external factors. Financial knowledge, the ability to know something and the ability to do that thing, are very different, right? It's kind of like, I can know that it's not good for me to eat an entire sleeve of Doritos or Pringles or a bunch of Oreos or whatever, but man, they look good and I just want to finish them all, right? Like, I can know something and not necessarily make the best choice. So again, there's so many different pieces of that we shouldn't just be looking at or giving more, sort of more power or more credence to one single component. So as we saw in the video, and as we look at this, there are these core elements, these three petals to the flower, if you will. We're going to start up here in the upper left-hand corner with financial knowledge and access. We've talked a bit about the knowledge already, but we look at this as an individual's ability to act in their own self-defined best financial interest. And I do want to pause there just for a second, because I think this also goes to that notion of, self-determined. I do get a little, concerned sometimes when I see, sort of value-laden statements in financial education materials, because, I don't know that we should always use things like, should, or, what have you. Like, what is in my own best financial interest and what's in your best financial interest may be very different. And so, every individual needs to weigh those, weigh different, criteria and make their own decision. So For example, choices about higher education, what I might think is in my own self-defined best financial interest may be different than yours, and that's okay. We all have that ability. What part of that, of what goes into financial well-being, is that freedom of choice to be able to decide, well, what is in my best interest? And again, self-determined and self-assessed. So looking at the financial knowledge and skills piece of this petal, if you will, financial knowledge, it's the mastery of content, right? It's a lot of what we measure in all forms of education, right? Like, do you know this? The skills are, sort of the knowledge put into action, right? So if you've taken a look at the national standards, for example, in personal finance from the Council for Economic Education and Jumpstart, you'll see they actually include pretty much knowledge and skills. This is what we want you to know. And with that knowledge, this is what we think you should be able to do with that. And so, it puts both sides of that into the equation, which really you need both. You don't necessarily know how to act if you don't have that knowledge, if you don't understand, what certain things are all about. You have to have one in order to do the other. Then when we look at access and inclusion, this is a little bit different. This has very often sort of a policy component to it. Can be other factors that interplay here. Arguably, for example, a foundational factor we'll see in a minute is geography. I mentioned in our earlier afternoon session, I think it was last week, I saw an article come up that in Chester, Pennsylvania, there is now one remaining branch of a financial institution. So if you live in Chester, you still have access to a bank. You don't have any choices though. So, that's limiting. If you live in a rural area where there is no access to a financial institution. I lived in a rural area for 10 years, where actually the year that we moved, the only bank branch in town, the only bank in town closed down. Granted, very rural area. We also didn't have a stoplight or a lot of other things, but that had a big impact on access in terms of financial components and day-to-day financial transactions for many individuals in that area. And so, access and participation, full participation in financial society does vary a lot from one person to the next, sometimes impacting larger communities. So this idea that many individuals still face systemic barriers to full inclusion. You cannot reliably do online banking without decent internet access, right? So all of these different barriers that may have nothing to do with an individual, or that an individual all on their own can't necessarily overcome, and that might stand in their way of doing certain things. So that is certainly a component in that core element of financial knowledge and access. As we move down here, we start to look at these foundational factors. So these include both the internal and external factors that influence both of those other parts. So not only do they influence the financial well-being, but they also impact the other two sides. So I mentioned earlier how geography, for example, where you live may impact or limit your access and inclusion in financial society, as an example. Values and beliefs very much influence your mindset, that we'll see in a minute when it comes to taking action and making decisions. So Types of things that fall under foundational factors, basic literacy and numeracy. Interestingly enough, if you look at some of the work that's been done in OECD countries, evaluating financial knowledge of youth as well as other core knowledge, if you will, there's a very high correlation frequently between countries with high financial literacy rates of youth as well as going hand in hand with high math knowledge and math scores. So interesting how those can go hand in hand. The self-advocacy piece, I think this is, a really important component. If we think about our students nowadays and their ability to, self-advocate for them, to be able to go after and ask for what it is they need and make things happen. We have a generation of kids right now raised by helicopter parents. Do they have the self-advocacy skills that they need to be able to go and question a bill or question a charge on an account, or go and ask questions or negotiate to get a good deal on something? Those are things that take self-advocacy and communication skills. On the values and beliefs side of this, we're looking at things like our your motivations, your attitudes about things. Some of these are more behavioral finance oriented, like cognitive bias and time discounting. Pretty much everybody has a level of risk that they're willing to take. And that can be sort of very much a part of who you are. For some people, thinking about finances is very stressful, and so that has a component. And then trust in the financial system. If you don't trust a bank to have your money available when you need it, hello, bank closures recently, that impacts your level of financial well-being and or some of the decisions that you're going to make. The foundational factors, by the way, I should go back and just clarify that, if you also have the financial knowledge to know that, for example, the FDIC and the NCUA, insure deposits up to $250,000 per person, then maybe you don't worry as much, or maybe you would have more trust in financial institutions. So again, that sort of, two-way, three-way goes backs and forths. I kind of almost think that this, like, somebody could make like a little visual of this, like one of those old pinball machines, right? Like it's sort of bing, 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 all these sort of things, like interdependent. One's a flipper, one's a, bounce off thing. Anyhow, so other foundational factors, we think about families, we think about family composition, culture, lots of components with that influence how we look at money, how we think about things, what's expected of us, and the impact that might have on our finances. And then socioeconomics and geography, this, the state of the economy, just in general, I mean, who feels good when they go at the grocery store and look at their bill nowadays, right? Like that impacts all of us from a financial well-being standpoint. Socioeconomics and systemic inequality, components there that are just, as I sort of talked about earlier with my former students, highly impacted in that. Issues that are specific to a region or a location, for example, about whether it's that access point, or even things that impact people's people in certain places and others. You think about victims of tornadoes or wildfires or hurricanes, and the impact that has on individuals' finances when it comes to their home being washed away, or the place that they used to work, or the business they owned being destroyed. It's so much sort of all over the place in that. So here's just a couple of idea discussion starters that you could use if you were talking about foundational factors and their impact with students. So getting them to really take some time and reflect on this. And again, this is about sort of using this as a framework to engage in these conversations with students to sort of broaden their perspective of what financial well-being is all about and what impacts it, and to be able to have those those higher level conversations with them. So again, this falls under the foundational factors. Let's move on up here to the financial actions and outcomes. And one of the things I love about this is that it's a feedback loop. So you see here, these arrows, right? It's like a cycle. It's like the hamster wheel. You can never get off of it, right? But your on point is over here with mindset and available choice set. And so this is, sort of where it gets started. We could have a little chicken and the egg, pricey egg, conversation here. But, the notion that, your decisions start with, well, what are my choices, right? What am I choosing between? And what is the mindset that I'm going into this decision with? And then from there, we go to, the decision and the outcome, which can be, by the way, either objective or subjective or both. Say, for example, we could look at, having opened a new bank account, or securing health insurance, or getting a better rate on your monthly cable bill. Those are all objective sort of measures or outcomes, but also subjective, the way that you feel about some of those types of things, all sorts of different components there. This leads to, financial outcomes, but sometimes other things get in the way, right? These unexpected events, which can very much be positive or negative, right? Maybe somebody gets a promotion at work, maybe, you find what you were looking for on sale, or, someplace else, on sort of all sorts of different scales, or negative, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of sort of, catastrophic events, or hello global pandemic, right? Lots of different pieces and parts there. So when it comes to students in this, I think, again, where we were talking about earlier, that, I don't think it's just that knowledge influencer piece that teachers have a role of playing here with students. One of the big things that I see here is our opportunity to offer practice with decision making, a safe place to role play and simulate these decisions before they're actually going to have an impact on you and your real financial well-being, right? So think about, everything from like a stock market simulation to a classroom economy where you earn, whatever those, the bucks are, or whatever it is, even in first and second grade, right? All of these are opportunities to engage in financial decision making in that safe practice space, where we can hone some of these skills, and even then sort of break them apart, debrief them, think about how those decisions were made, and perhaps could have been made better. Again, here also the study of behavioral finance can play into this, in terms of understanding why we make some of the decisions that we do. And then here, another opportunity to engage with students and have them reflect about things like, thinking about a specific financial decision, either of theirs or somebody that they know, and, can they identify different components of this? What were the choices? What decision was made? What was the outcome? And then most importantly, again, it's the hamster wheel, right? Like, you start and it keeps going, right? So one decision likely will impact your future decisions, ideally, right? Like we learn, the school of hard knocks is one of the best, forms of financial education out there, right? So that's that's taking a look at all of those different components there within this model. But then we looked at these catalysts for change, right? So what are the catalysts for change, the pieces and parts that influence what's on the inside here? So these sort of outside, folks or things outside of the individual that change a person's financial well-being. Well, knowledge influencers. So you as an educator, and I'm focusing here on you as educators and what you can do. We've talked about some of these things, but also teaching students how to know where to get good financial information, who to trust, what to look for, how to use tools to their advantage, like, online calculators and other things like that. that can help them to build their financial knowledge and skills over time. Structural policy changes, right? So this notion of looking at advocating for policies. We talked more about some of the bigger picture access and inclusion pieces, but I would argue that access and inclusion in financial education is an important component and a structural policy change that educators might get engaged in. Behavior influencers, we don't just change students' behavior or students' knowledge and skills. A lot of what we do is aimed at changing their behaviors and their mindset and their attitudes. So again, those simulations, behavioral finance, those kinds of things. This is one that we haven't touched on yet, but this notion of social and material supports. So introducing students to where they might access support going forward, whether that's things in terms of government programs, maybe government or funded benefits, or things like housing and credit counseling for individuals, or just the fact that where to go for some of those different components when you need help with decision making, or other components that might impact things in that realm. So all of this again is, so I sort of flew through all of these different components of the of that ecosystem. I am offering you some questions for self-reflection. So, some things here to think about, like, how has your own financial well-being changed over time? Is it better or worse than it used to be? Can you think about a time that it was maybe, you felt really good, and other times that you maybe didn't feel so well? And would you be comfortable sharing that with your students? I always say that one of the things I love about personal finance is that it is personal, right? It is, something that you can make very real and tangible and share some stories. And that is often what, really connects with your students, right? And then, just some other things to think about, like, how could you engage or introduce this to your students? What aspects of this might you want to dive into a little bit more, or even this notion of like differentiation and what have you. So those are some things to take away and think about. As I mentioned before, the personal finance ecosystem is available on NEFE's website. But before we go, I wanted to mention that coming soon, there should be some additional educator resources that you can access, an educator's guide and some classroom resources that when those come out, we will be sure to share and send to you. In addition, there are some resources from the CFPB, which is the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. They've done a lot of research and work around financial well-being, in particular with adults. But you'll see their definition and what we talked about earlier was very similar, especially this like 2x2 net matrix, right? Now looking at the present and the future, choice, and that sort of feeling secure both now and later. They have their own sort of graphic around what influences financial well-being. And then the tools that I specifically would suggest looking at, if you're interested in some of this, is measuring your own financial well-being. This is meant to be a very quick 10 question sort of questionnaire or quiz survey kind of thing for adults. That is interesting and useful. And then for children or for young people, they have a Map Your Money Journey, which is available for grades 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and for 9 through 12. So these are all some additional resources that are more focused on the center part, that financial well-being. So these are available as both PDF, print copy sort of things, as well as an interactive survey that students can take. So I know that was a lot, and I feel like I flew through a lot of content. If we were in person, we'd have had some great conversations, I think, about these. But I encourage you to go and spend a little time thinking about your students and your own financial well-being. What impacts it? What can you individually for yourself control and influence, and what role can you play for your students in improving their financial well-being over time. So thank you so much for being here with us this evening. It's been great to have you, and we hope to have you back on another webinar or other professional development with us at the Making Sense Project sometime soon.